The Manhattan streets buzzed with their usual late-night chaos. Yellow taxis swerved through traffic, their horns competing with the chatter of tourists admiring the towering holiday lights. The city felt alive, but for some, it was a brutal reminder of what they didn't have. Barron Trump, stepping out of an exclusive charity gala in a sharp navy suit, was deep in thought as he walked toward his waiting vehicle. The event had been a success, raising millions for causes Barron believed in. But something about the opulence of it all didn't sit right with him tonight. As his security team flanked him, guiding him toward the SUV, a faint sound caught Barron's attention, a low, hoarse cough. He stopped in his tracks, his eyes scanning the sidewalk until they landed on a figure slumped against the cold stone wall of a building. A homeless man, barely covered by a worn-out coat, was huddled against the icy wind. His hands shook as he tried to light a cigarette, the damp matchstick refusing to cooperate. Barron paused, his brow furrowing. "Wait," he said to his security detail, brushing past their protective formation. "Sir, we need to keep moving," one of the guards urged, his voice firm. Ignoring the warning, Barron approached the man, who flinched at the sound of footsteps drawing near. "Sir," Barron began, keeping his tone gentle, "are you all right?" The man slowly raised his head. His eyes, sunken and tired, met Barron's gaze. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether the young man in the designer suit was speaking to him or someone else. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice raspy and uncertain. "You don't look fine," Barron said, crouching down despite the biting wind that swept through the street. He studied the man's face, noting the lines of hardship etched deeply into his features. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, as if debating whether to answer. Finally he said, "Frank. Hi, Frank. I'm Barron." Barron extended a hand, and after a moment of hesitation, Frank shook it. His grip was weak, his fingers icy cold. Barron couldn't help but notice the scars on Frank's hands and the frayed edges of his coat. "What are you doing out here in this weather?" Barron asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern. Frank looked away, his shoulders hunching as if to shield himself from the weight of the question. "Just trying to get through the night," he mumbled. "It's not like anyone cares." "I care," Barron replied firmly, surprising not just Frank but also his security team, who exchanged uncertain glances behind him. "Everyone deserves better than this." Frank let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That's easy for you to say, kid. You've probably never had a bad day in your life." Barron didn't flinch at the remark. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You're right, I've been fortunate. But that's exactly why I'm here. Maybe I can help." Frank looked at him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher whether this young man was serious or just another passerby offering empty words. "Help," he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "How?" Frank's hand trembled as he clutched the cup of coffee Barron had handed him. The warmth seeped into his fingers, a stark contrast to the cold he'd grown used to. For a moment, he couldn't help but wonder if this was all some elaborate dream. Why would someone like Barron Trump, a name that carried power and prestige, care about someone like him? But Barron wasn't the only one paying attention. A woman in a sharp suit, holding a notepad and phone, stood at the edge of the growing crowd. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Barron and Frank interact. She whispered into her phone, "You're not going to believe this. Barron Trump just sat down with a homeless guy. This could be huge." Barron noticed her. He leaned slightly toward Frank and spoke in a low voice. "Stay calm, but I think we're being watched. Let's keep this between us for now." Frank nodded, his gaze shifting nervously toward the woman. "I'm not used to this kind of attention," he muttered. Barron smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry. I've dealt with worse." The woman stepped forward, her phone camera raised. "Barron, care to comment on what's happening here? Is this a publicity stunt?" Barron stood, his towering frame blocking her view of Frank. His voice was firm but calm. "This isn't a story. It's a private moment. Please respect that. But she wasn't back in gown. The public has a right to know. A Trump helping the homeless? That's bound to raise questions. Frank's grip on the coffee tightened, his face a mixture of fear and frustration. I don't want no trouble, he whispered. Barron turned back to Frank, his voice softening. You're not in trouble, Frank. Let me handle this. He faced the woman again, his expression unreadable. If you really want a story, how about highlighting the struggles veterans face every day? The real story isn't me, it's him and countless others like him. The crowd murmured in agreement, some even applauding Barron's response. The woman hesitated, realizing she wasn't going to win this round. But the tension wasn't over. One of Barron's security guards approached him, whispering urgently. Sir, there's a group of reporters gathering nearby. It's starting to escalate. Barron exhaled sharply. Fine, let's move this somewhere quieter. He turned to Frank. Come with me. I know a place where we can talk in peace. Frank hesitated. Are you sure? This feels a little too much. Barron smiled. Trust me. It's just a short drive. As the two made their way to a black SUV parked nearby, the murmurs of the crowd followed them. Cameras flashed and questions were shouted, but Barron stayed focused on Frank. Once inside the car, the chaos of the street faded into silence. Frank let out a shaky breath. I ain't never been in a car this nice. Barron chuckled. Get used to it. We've got work to do. The car pulled away, but the challenges weren't over yet. In the next part, we'll dive into how Barron's actions stir up more controversy and how he navigates the obstacles that threaten to derail his efforts to help Frank. The SUV glided through the streets of Manhattan, its tinted windows shielding Barron and Frank from the chaos outside. Frank sat stiffly, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. I don't get it, he finally muttered. Why go through all this trouble for someone like me? Barron turned to him, his expression serious. Because someone has to, Frank, and if I can do something, I should. Frank shook his head. You don't know me. I've made mistakes, bad ones. People like me don't get second chances. Barron leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. You fought for this country, didn't you? Frank nodded slowly. Yeah, 2 tours overseas. But that was a lifetime ago. That matters, Barron said, his tone unwavering. It matters to me, and it matters to a lot of people who've forgotten what sacrifice looks like. Let's remind them. Frank didn't respond, but his grip on the seat loosened. For the first time in years, a flicker of hope began to take root. The SUV slowed as it approached a discreet entrance to one of Manhattan's high-end hotels. Barron's security team had already secured a private suite, ensuring Frank would have a safe, warm place to stay for the night. As they stepped out, Barron noticed a black sedan idling across the street. The faint glow of a phone camera caught his eye. Someone was still watching. Stay close, Barron said to Frank, his tone low but calm. They entered the hotel quickly, the concierge nodding respectfully as they passed. In the suite, Frank looked around in awe. The plush carpets, the oversized bed, and the soft glow of the city skyline through the windows were a far cry from the cold streets he'd grown used to. This is too much, he stammered. It's not enough, Barron replied, placing a hand on Frank's shoulder. This is just the start. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the next steps. For now, just rest. Frank hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can ever repay you. You don't have to, Barron said. Just promise me one thing, don't give up on yourself. Meanwhile, across town, the video of Barron helping Frank had already begun circulating online. Uploaded by an onlooker, it had been shared thousands of times within hours. Headlines started popping up. Barron Trump's unexpected act of kindness goes viral. Trump heir helps homeless veteran, real or staged. Barron Trump challenges public perception with bold gesture. But not all the attention was positive. A talk show host dissected the clip that same night, questioning Barron's motives. Is this genuine compassion or just a PR stunt? They sneered. And who is this veteran, anyway? Back in the suite, Barron's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. He ignored most of them until a call came through from someone he couldn't avoid: his father, Donald Trump. "Barron," the familiar voice boomed through the phone. "What's this I'm hearing about you taking in some homeless guy? The media's all over it." Barron paced the room, the phone pressed to his ear. "Dad, it's not just some homeless guy. He's a veteran. He served this country, and now he's been forgotten. I couldn't just walk away." Donald Trump's tone softened, but his words remained sharp. "Look, I'm not saying you did anything wrong. But you know how the media works. They'll twist this into something it's not." Barron stopped and leaned against the window, staring out at the glittering skyline. "Let them twist it," he said firmly. "If this makes people talk about how we treat veterans, then let them talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Trump spoke, his voice low. "All right, Barron. Do what you think is right. Just remember, you'll be under a microscope." "I always am," Barron replied, ending the call. As he turned back to the room, he found Frank sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his worn boots. "That was your dad, huh?" Frank asked quietly. "Yeah," Barron said, walking over. "He's worried about the media frenzy." Frank looked up, his face etched with guilt. Maybe this was a mistake. "I didn't mean to drag you into anything." "You didn't drag me into anything," Barron said firmly. "I chose this. Now let's focus on what comes next." The next morning, Barron woke early, his mind already racing with plans. He'd called several contacts overnight: veteran support groups, housing programs, even a few influential figures who could help amplify the message. But as he scrolled through his phone, he came across something that made his stomach drop. A viral post with Frank's face splashed across it read, "Exposed, homeless vet's troubled past." The attached article detailed minor infractions from Frank's younger days: arrests for public intoxication, a dismissed assault charge, and financial troubles. The piece painted him as a habitual failure. Barron clenched his jaw, anger surging through him. He walked into the suite's living room, where Frank sat sipping coffee. The veteran looked up, noticing the storm brewing in Barron's expression. "What's wrong?" Frank asked, already bracing for bad news. Barron hesitated, debating whether to show Frank the article. Finally, he placed his phone on the table, the headline glaring up at them. Frank's face fell. He stared at the screen, his hands trembling. "Guess I shouldn't be surprised," he said bitterly. "This is what people see when they look at me, a screw-up." "That's not what I see," Barron said, his voice steady. "And that's not what the world should see, either." Frank shook his head. "You don't get it, kid. People like me, we don't get redemption arcs. We're just reminders of what happens when life goes wrong." Barron stepped closer, his eyes blazing with determination. "Then we'll change the narrative. This isn't about your past, Frank. It's about your future. And if people want to dig up dirt, let them. We'll show them that you're more than that." Later that day, Barron arranged a meeting with representatives from a prominent veterans organization. Frank, hesitant but willing, accompanied him. As they walked into the sleek office, all eyes turned toward them. Some were skeptical, others curious. The organization's director, a stern woman in her 50s, greeted them with a measured smile. "Mr. Trump, Mr. Frank, please have a seat." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair, feeling out of place amidst the polished surroundings. But Barron's presence was a steadying force. "Thank you for meeting with us," Barron began. "Frank has a story that needs to be told, and I think your organization is the right platform to help him share it." The director leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. "Mr. Frank, would you be comfortable sharing your experiences? The good and the bad?" Frank hesitated, glancing at Barron for reassurance. "I've never been much of a talker," he admitted. "But if it helps other vets like me, I'll do it." Barron smiled, his confidence infectious. "It will help, Frank. You're going to show people that it's never too late to rebuild." As the meeting wrapped up, Barron's phone buzzed with a new notification. A breaking news alert flashed on the screen. Barron Trump's bold move to help homeless veteran gains national attention. The story was picking up steam, and Barron knew they were only just getting started. He turned to Frank as they stepped out of the office. "This is bigger than you and me now. Are you ready for what's next?" Frank straightened his posture, a spark of determination in his eyes. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I am." The rally's success rippled across the nation, igniting debates in newsrooms, on social media, and even in Congress. Yet for Barron and Frank, the real work had only just begun. Back in New York, Barron received a late-night call from an anonymous number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Mr. Trump," a deep, gravelly voice said. "You're making waves and not everyone's happy about it." Barron frowned. "Who is this?" "That's not important," the voice replied. "Let's just say there are people who benefit from keeping veterans where they are. People with a lot of influence. Back off, or there will be consequences." The line went dead. Barron sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the threat sinking in. But instead of fear, he felt a surge of determination. He immediately dialed a trusted contact, an investigative journalist he'd worked with before. The next day, Barron met with the journalist, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel Miller. He explained the situation and handed over the anonymous note Frank had received along with a recording of the threatening call. Rachel's eyes narrowed as she examined the evidence. "This isn't just about you or Frank," she said. "There's a bigger system at play here, and someone doesn't want it exposed." "Then let's expose it," Barron said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Rachel agreed to launch an investigation, promising to keep Barron updated. Meanwhile, Barron and Frank continued their advocacy efforts, but the tension was palpable. Security around Barron was increased, and Frank grew more anxious with each passing day. "Maybe it's time to lay low," Frank suggested one evening as they reviewed plans for their next event. Barron shook his head. "That's exactly what they want. We're not stopping." A week later, Rachel's investigation yielded shocking results. She uncovered a web of corruption involving powerful figures who profited from underfunded veteran programs. The revelations were damning, implicating politicians, corporate executives, and even a few charities that had been skimming funds. Rachel called Barron with the news. "This is explosive," she said, "but going public with this will make you a target." Barron didn't hesitate. "Release it. People need to know." The fallout was immediate. The story dominated headlines, and protests erupted across the country, demanding accountability. Frank watched in awe as the movement he had inadvertently become part of grew into a national reckoning. But the threats against Barron escalated. Late one night, a brick was thrown through the window of the hotel where Frank was staying, shattering the glass and narrowly missing him. Barron arrived moments later, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. "This is getting dangerous," Frank said, his voice shaking. Barron placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're not backing down. They can try to scare us, but they won't stop us." Barron sat in a dimly lit room, the hum of tension almost tangible as his team huddled around a table scattered with documents, photos and messages from Rachel's investigation. Frank was there too, his unease barely masked as he glanced at the stacks of evidence. Barron leaned forward, his eyes locked on a grainy photograph Rachel had sent over a powerful CEO shaking hands with a senator, both men grinning next to a massive banner for a supposed veteran support fund. It was all a front. "This isn't just corruption," Barron muttered. "This is exploitation. They're profiting off the backs of the very people they claim to help." Frank cleared his throat. "This is way over my head, kid. These are the kind of people who don't lose." Barron looked up, his expression resolute. "That's exactly why we have to take them down." Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was Rachel. "Barron," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You need to see this. Turn on Channel 6. Barron grabbed the remote, and the screen flickered to life. A breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom. Barron Trump faces backlash amid investigation. Leaked emails suggest manipulation. What the hell? Barron muttered. The anchor began detailing alleged emails between Barron and key figures in the veterans organization, claiming they showed plans to use Frank's story as a publicity stunt. The accusations were false, but the damage was immediate. Frank buried his face in his hands. They're framing you. They're framing us. Barron's jaw tightened. This is a smear campaign. They're trying to discredit everything we've done. The next morning, protesters gathered outside the Trump Tower, their chants echoing through the streets. Barron refused to stay silent. He called a press conference, facing a sea of flashing cameras and skeptical reporters. "Let me make one thing clear," Barron began, his voice steady but firm. "These accusations are baseless. The people behind them are the same ones who have been exploiting veterans for years. They're scared because we're exposing the truth." Frank stood beside him, visibly nervous but determined. When Barron gestured for him to speak, Frank stepped forward, gripping the sides of the podium. "I was homeless, forgotten, and invisible until this young man gave me a chance. I'm here to tell you that everything he's done has been genuine. These lies won't stop us from fighting for what's right." The crowd erupted in applause, but the tension was far from over. That evening, Barron received another anonymous message, this time a video sent to his phone. It showed grainy surveillance footage of Frank sitting on a park bench, the timestamp from weeks earlier. A voiceover played, sinister and calm. "We know everything about your little friend, Mr. Trump. If you care about his safety, you'll stop digging." Barron's hands shook as he watched. He immediately called Rachel, who arrived at his apartment within the hour. She studied the video, her face pale. "This isn't just a threat," she said. "It's a warning. They're escalating." Frank, who had been listening from the corner, stood up abruptly. "I'm not going to be the reason you get hurt, Barron. I'll leave disappear if I have to." Barron spun around, his voice sharp. "No, that's what they want. We stick together. If we back down now, they win." Barron and Rachel worked through the night, piecing together the final threads of evidence. Rachel's team managed to trace the email leak to a shell company, linked to the same CEO in the photo. They now had proof not only of corruption, but of an active conspiracy to sabotage their efforts. Barron made a decision. "We're taking this straight to the FBI." Rachel nodded. "It's risky, but it's the right move." Frank hesitated. "Do you think they'll even listen?" "They'll have to," Barron said. "Because we're not just fighting for us, we're fighting for every veteran who's been left behind." The FBI meeting was tense. Agents flipped through damning evidence Barron and Rachel had painstakingly gathered, while screens displayed incriminating emails, financial transactions, and video footage tying powerful figures to the conspiracy. Agent Peterson, leading the investigation, sat silently as he absorbed the magnitude of what lay before him. After what felt like an eternity, he finally broke the silence. "This is explosive," he said, his tone measured. "If everything here holds up, we're looking at one of the most significant corruption scandals in recent history." Barron, his resolve unshaken, replied, "It's not just about exposing them. It's about fixing this broken system. Veterans deserve better." Peterson extended his hand, his face stern but respectful. "We'll take it from here. But understand, Mr. Trump, this won't be easy. Be ready for pushback. This will shake a lot of powerful people." As the FBI investigation went public, the fallout was immediate and far-reaching. News outlets exploded with coverage, plastering headlines that ignited outrage across the country. Protests erupted in cities nationwide, calling for justice and systemic reform. For Barron, however, the fight wasn't over. Late one night, Rachel called him with an urgent update. "They're fighting back hard," she said, her voice tense. "The CEO and his allies are denying everything. They're accusing you of fabricating evidence and threatening massive lawsuits." Barron felt the weight of her words but refused to falter. Let them. We have the truth on our side, and we're not backing down. The situation escalated further when Barron, Rachel, and Frank were called to testify in a high-stakes congressional hearing. The room was packed with every seat filled and cameras broadcasting the proceedings lived to millions. Sitting tall and composed, Barron faced a barrage of questions from skeptical lawmakers. One senator, his tone sharp, asked, "Mr. Trump, why risk so much? You could have walked away and avoided all of this." Barron's answer was steady and heartfelt. Walking away would mean letting people like Frank continue to suffer in silence. It would mean accepting a system that turns its back on those who've sacrificed everything for this country. I couldn't live with that. Frank, speaking after Barron, delivered an emotional account of his journey. "I'm not just a statistic. I'm a person who was forgotten, abandoned by the system. Barron didn't just give me a second chance, he reminded me that I still matter. That's something I'll never forget." As Frank finished, a ripple of emotion swept through the room. Reporters captured every word, and the audience, initially skeptical, erupted into applause that carried on long after the testimony ended. The nation was watching, and the tide was turning. The FBI's investigation culminated in a series of high-profile arrests and sweeping reforms to veteran support programs. Barron's relentless determination had sparked a movement that transcended politics and personal gain. Frank, now an outspoken advocate for veterans, stood proudly beside Barron during a White House ceremony celebrating the changes they had inspired. As the president commended their efforts, Frank turned to Barron and said with a wry smile, "Never thought I'd end up here, kid." Barron returned the smile, his voice filled with humility. "You've earned every bit of this." Months later, Barron sat down for a televised interview that delved into the journey he and Frank had shared. Reflecting on the challenges, he said, "This was never about me. It was about standing up for what's right and giving people hope. If one more person finds the courage to fight for what they believe in because of this, then it was all worth it." As the interview concluded, Barron turned to the camera, his words resonating deeply with viewers everywhere. Change doesn't come from waiting. It starts with one voice, one step, and the courage to do what's right, even when it's hard. The story closed as a testament to resilience, compassion, and the enduring impact of taking a stand. For Barron and Frank, what began as a chance encounter had blossomed into a movement that would leave an indelible mark on the nation. Frank's story is just one of many untold stories out there, reminding us of the power of compassion and second chances. What would you do if you were in Barron's position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Together, we can inspire change. See you in the next video.